Wide on a river bottom at first light, frost silvering 100 miles of Kentucky nothing. The camera drifts down to a single line of bare sticks pressed into the mud along the swollen creek. They shouldn't be there. Nobody plants them with diamonds in there. Closer now. A boy's hands, 13 years old, blistered raw, working another leafless whip into ground that fights him for every inch. He does not look up. He does not explain. Up on the far slope, a man stands with his hands in his pockets watching the water, watching the boy. He has already decided something. The killdeer have left the low ground. The creek runs the color of old coffee higher than anyone can remember. Somewhere behind a dark window, papers come due that no crop can pay. 2 years of quiet work, one night of rising water, and a bank that will either hold. The first morning, it looked like nothing at all. A boy of 13 crouched at the raw lip of Coldwater Creek in the blue hour before the school bus came driving a borrowed spade into ground, still stiff with frost. He worked slow, methodical, opening a hole, setting something into it, closing the hole, shuffling a pace downstream to open the next. His breath smoked in the gray light. The clay fought him for every inch it gave, gumming the blades, sucking at his boots, until the leather went black to the ankle and stayed that way. He said not one word to explain himself then or after to the mother who watched from the porch, or the brother who passed on the way to the barn. He only bent Doug-set clothes, moved on as though the doing of it were an answer sufficient to any question a person might think to ask. By the second morning, his palms had risen into soft blisters below the fingers. By the fourth, they had broken, wept, dried into a rough map of the work. By the end of that first week, the whole county road had taken notice, which in a place like Casey County, Kentucky, was the same thing as being talked about at length. If a story of this kind, a story about a patience nobody around him understood, and a wisdom that did its real work out of sight, means something to you, take a moment now to subscribe and pull up a chair among a growing family of folks who still believe the land keeps lessons worth learning. Tell us in the comments what corner of the world you're watching from. We would count it an honor to know you. What the boy had been setting into the mud one length every few feet in a patient marching line were willow whips. Long, flexible, leafless shoots cut from a mature tree in its dormant season, bundled in wet burlap that smelled of river bottom, ordered from a conservation nursery upstate at his own expense. He pressed them in from the leaning fence post near the pasture gate all the way down to the wide green bend where the creek slowed to a crawl in the heat of July. Dozens of them. Bare sticks with no leaf, no bud, no promise showing on them anywhere going into cold ground with the hard part of winter still bearing down. A person driving past could be forgiven for thinking the boy had lost his sense. Folks in that country had witnessed their share of odd doings across the years. They had known a mule that unlatched gates with its lip and a man who kept bees in his hat brim for a wager. But a boy setting out what looked to be shade trees along a creek that flooded clean out every few seasons, planting them leafless into the dying end of the year, was a thing worth turning over slow at the feed store counter while the coffee went cold in the cup. That was Toby Renfrew for you, they said. Never a word out of him you had to ask for, always a notion in him you'd never think of. Half of them figured he'd give it up by Christmas. The other half had learned over the years not to bet against the quiet one. He was the third of 4 children on a place that raised tobacco and ran cattle ground. The Renfrews had worked since his great-grandfather first broke the sod in the spring of 1908. The deed had passed father to son across 4 generations without ever once leaving the family, which in that part of the state was a kind of wealth no bank statement could measure. His father, Owen Renfrew, was a spare and careful man who spent neither words nor motion. He did not have to fare past his own interests worn down in the manner farmers wear down, like a fence post that has stood too many winters and leans now against the weather rather than into it. His mother, Della, kept the farm's ledgers in a hand, so even it might have been set in type, raised the 4 children without ever appearing to rush a single one of them, still found the hours to grow a kitchen garden that put every table in the county to shame come August. Toby was not the Renfrew a stranger would have remembered first. His older brother Garrett took the blue ribbons at the county fair every summer, his steer curried to a shine, his grip already firm as a grown man's, his laugh easy in a crowd. His younger sister Nora carried home the marks that made her teachers pencil kind words into the margins of her papers, the kind of child adults predict great things for out loud in front of her without meaning any harm by it. Toby carried home neither ribbon nor high mark. What Toby carried was harder to hold up to the light. He was the one you did not notice had entered a room until he spoke, and he spoke seldom. And when he did, the family had learned to listen because the quiet ones spend their words the way a careful man spends the last of his seed corn, only on ground he trusts to give it back. Every Sunday morning, while the rest of the house slept late or dressed for the drive to church, Toby walked the fence line. No one had asked him to. No one paid him for it. He walked it because he wanted to know what a week had changed, what the frost had heaved or the cattle had worn, or the water had cut the small, slow shifts a place makes in itself when a person isn't looking. He came in one April and told his father the south field was shedding its water slower than it used to, that the low corner held a wet foot longer than the year before, and nobody credited it until the standing puddles bore him out that May. He found a staple worked loose in a run of wire. 3 days ahead of the morning, a heifer would have shouldered through the gap onto the road. He did not announce these findings. He filed them behind his eyes and carried them without comment, the way another boy might carry a smooth stone in his pocket, purely for the weight of it, for the private pleasure of a thing known. There was a saying his grandfather had for it, one Toby had taken so far into himself, he no longer knew he was living by it. A man who watches the ground long enough stops being surprised by it. The boy had watched the ground a long time already for one so young. Surprise came rarely to him. What came instead was a slow accumulation of knowing laid down season over season, like the silt the creek left in the bottom, until the day arrived when he understood a thing about that farm that not one grown man on it had thought to understand. The planning had begun the October after he turned 13, but it had begun in his mind a good deal earlier, and it had begun with a request. He had gone to his father the way he went to Owen with anything that touched the land, hat literally in his hand, waited for the older man to lower his coffee cup. What Owen offered back was as near to a blessing as any Renfrew ever spent. Long as the chores don't come up short for it, the creek's yours to work. That was the whole of the permission, freely given gruff, without a question, as to what the boy meant to grow there. Owen did not ask. It was not the family's way to pry a thing loose before its owner was ready to hand it over, a courtesy Toby had inherited along with the brown of his father's eyes. The money for the Willows was his own earned dollar by aching dollar through a summer spent throwing hay bales for the Prentice place 2 roads north, his shirt sweated through by 9 in the morning, his forearms scored with the fine cuts baling twine leaves in a boy's skin. He had saved every bit of that wage in a coffee can under his bed, then sent it all to the nursery upstate on a mail-order form he'd filled out 3 times before he got it clean. Other boys his age were saving toward a rifle, a used motorbike, a girl's attention. Toby saved toward a bundle of sticks. He would not have traded. When the Willows arrived, his neighbor Virgil Tanner was leaning on the Renfrew gate post passing the time, as Virgil did most afternoons, having exhausted the conversation at his own place hours before. He eyed the burlap bundle like it might contain a live snake. "The devil are those meant to be, son." The answer came back, level, unhurried. "Willows." Virgil chewed on the word a while, working it for hidden meaning. "For shade, you mean?" A pause. Something in that line. Virgil scratched the loose skin under his jaw, found no further foothold in the exchange, drove home to inform his wife over supper that the Renfrew boy had gone down to the water to plant sticks in the muck, like a scarecrow that had misplaced its field. She laughed into her cornbread, allowed that it sounded about right for that one. The boy who saw what nobody else saw said less about it than any living soul. Merle Colfax came past on his tractor a few days on, throttled the old machine down to a clatter, hollered across the ditch over the diesel. "Boy, them banks flood plumb out ever 3-4 years. Whatever it is you're setting there, it's bound for Tennessee come the first high water." Toby lifted a hand in something a person could take for thanks, kept right on pressing whips into the soft edge of the bank. His father watched once or twice from the crown of the rise hands buried in his coat, neither pushing the boy on nor calling him off, only standing witness in that Renfrew way, letting a body have his own labor to succeed or fail by. At the supper table, Della asked Soft what he was hoping to raise up out of all that mud. Toby turned his fork a slow half circle against the plate. "I'll tell it when there's a thing worth the telling." Nobody leaned on him. That was the grain of them, of people who let a man keep his own counsel until he chose to spend it. Though Toby spent his rarer than any of them. What not one of them knew, not his father, nor his mother, nor a single voice that laughed at the sticks in the creek, was where the whole notion had first taken hold of him. It had come the summer before, across 2 unhurried weeks he'd passed at his grandfather's place over in Bourbon County. and it had lodged in him like a burr under the skin. The kind of person cannot work loose, no matter how he tries. Amos Ledbetter was 74 that summer. Della's father, a widower living alone at the end of a gravel lane, with a dog gone too old and deaf to bark at anything. For 3 decades, he had worked as a soil conservation technician, driving the red dog back roads of half a dozen counties, standing in ruined gullies alongside grim hat-in-hand farmers, helping men hold on to ground they could not spare and could not wash away without watching a piece of their lives go with it. He was mostly finished with the world's hard work. By then his knees ground down to a grinding ache, his back a barometer for coming rain. His mind, though, still cut clean and straight, keen as the draw knife he kept oiled on its peg beside the kitchen door, the one tool in the house he would let no one else touch. The boy loved him with the uncomplicated love a quiet child keeps for the one adult who has never once told him to speak up, to come out of himself to be more like his brother. Around Amos, being watchful was not a fault to be corrected. It was the whole of the trade. Those 2 weeks were the making of him, though neither of them would have said so at the time. In the mornings they walked. The old man could not go far or fast anymore, but he could go slow, and slow was how a person learned to see. He taught the boy to read a hillside the way another man reads a page, to tell where the water wanted to go by the lay of the grass, to find the old scars of gullies healed over, and the fresh ones just starting to know good ground from ground that was quietly bleeding itself away. He did not lecture. He pointed and waited and let the boy come to the seeing himself, which is the only kind of seeing that stays. One evening near dark, the two of them had walked down a fence line to a spot where a neighbor's creek bank had come entirely apart, and it was a hard thing for a person to look on. The kind of erosion that appears as though some enormous spoon had descended out of the sky to scoop the earth away in long, wet gouges, leaving the raw subsoil bared to the light, the roots of the pasture grass dangling over nothing. A fresh new edge cut a full yard back from where the old one had stood a year before. Amos stood over the ruin without speaking, a good long while the way he did with any matter that carried weight. Then low near to himself, "You know what mends a thing like this?" Toby did not. "Willows." The word came across the dusk like a coin passed hand to hand under a table. Set them thick right along the edge. Give them 2 winters, maybe 3. The roots run deeper than a man would ever credit, and they weave down through the bank from the underside. Lace the whole of it together like a country doctor stitching a wound closed. The water can rise all it wants. It can shove and claw and carry. It meets those roots, and for once in its life, the water is the thing that loses. The old man had let that settle into the boy before he finished it. The two of them standing over the wound in the earth while the light drained out of the sky. A hard bank fights the current head-on and cracks and gives way all at once. A living bank bends with the water and holds. There's the whole of the lesson if you can hold it. Most men can't. They want the wall. They don't trust the willow. He had gone up to the house, then come back with a booklet from the county extension office, thin as a Sunday church program, its cheap paper worn soft at the corners from years of a rough thumb turning the pages. Stream bank stabilization using native vegetation. Toby read it end to end twice on the bus ride home the following week, then a third time by flashlight under his own quilt. What his grandfather had spoken over that gully was not a story to pass an evening. It was knowledge earned by standing in mud 30 years, and the boy received it as exactly that, a thing to be kept and one day used. The science under it was as sound as anything a person could learn in a lifetime of watching water. The black willow above all native across the whole warm reach of the American South, up through the river bottoms of the Midwest, stands among the finest natural tools a body has for holding a stream bank against the sideways pull of a current. Its roots grow fast, fine, aggressive, past counting, threading into wet soil quicker than nearly anything else that puts down a root at all. Under a load, they bend where a rigid thing would snap. Set close along a failing edge, they knit a living mesh beneath the surface, binding the earth against the shove of high water, trapping the sediment. The flood would otherwise strip away, slowing the current where it grinds against the bank until its teeth can find nothing left to bite. It was not magic, it was patience given a shape a person could plant. Toby had taken it in, the only way a boy who walks fence lines takes in anything. Not as a fact to be recited back for a grade, but as a truth that would matter someday on his own ground, at an hour when every soul he knew had forgotten he had ever spoken of it. He folded the booklet into his shirt, carried it home against his chest, told not one living person what he intended to do with what it held. On the long bus ride back into Casey County, he watched the creeks go by out the window, and where another boy saw only water and weeds, he saw banks that were holding and banks that were losing, and he understood for the first time that his own family's creek belonged to the second kind, and that nobody had ever done a single thing about it because nobody had ever believed there was a thing to be done. There was a reason the creek bank mattered to him past what any boy should feel for a stretch of mud, though it took a night in late September to make the reason plain, weeks before the first whip ever touched the ground. He had come downstairs past his bedtime for a glass of water, his sock feet silent on the treads, and found his parents at the kitchen table beneath a yellow lamp with the ledgers spread open between them. They were speaking in the low, careful register a husband and wife use when they believed the house asleep around them, and the words carried up the dark stairwell to where the boy stood unseen. The tobacco crop had come in short 2 years running. There were papers now on the Southfield papers, held by the bank down in Liberty papers, that had not existed when Toby was small enough to ride his father's shoulders through that same field. The note fell due on its own schedule market, or no market, rain or no rain. He did not fully follow the arithmetic of it, the interest in the principle in the slow, terrible mathematics by which a farm goes under one dry season at a time. What he followed was the set of his father's shoulders, the way Owen pressed the heel of one hand hard against his own brow, as though he could shove the numbers back into some column where they behaved. He heard his mother's voice come steady across the table low, but without a tremor in it. "We have held this ground through worse weather than a soft market, Owen Renfrew. We'll hold it through this one too." He heard his father answer, and the answer was the thing that stayed lodged in the boy for years after spoken so quiet, it was nearly meant for no ears at all. A man can lose in a single flood what 4 generations gave their whole lives to make. That's the part that keeps me up, not the market, the water. Toby went back up the stairs without his water. He lay a long while in the dark, listening to the old house tick and settle. The creek in his mind had stopped being a line of sticks in a boy's odd project. It ran now along the edge of everything his family was, everything they had, everything they stood to lose in a single bad rise. The South Field was the heart of the trouble of the creek, its open weakness. The finest of the Renfrew bottomland lay cradled in the crook of Coldwater Creek, dark, loamy ground his great-grandfather had built up out of 100 years of river silt, the kind of dirt a man in that country would trade a year off the end of his life to own. But the same creek that had laid that soil down across a century could carry it off again in a night. Every time the water jumped its banks and gnawed itself a fresh edge, it took the field's best inches with it, in long brown ribbons moving its channel a little nearer the heart of the good ground, with each high season like a slow thief who returns to the same house year on year, taking a little more each visit, never enough to raise an alarm until the day the house stands empty. Toby had watched that theft his whole short life without ever knowing the name for what he watched. Now he had the name. He had the science. He had a booklet worn soft at the corners, a reason lodged behind his ribs, like a coal that would not cool. So the sticks in the creek were never about shade, never about a strange boy's whim, whatever the men at the feed store made of them. They were about the papers down in Liberty, about the hard set of his father's shoulders under the yellow lamp, about the long arithmetic of loss he had overheard through a dark stairwell. The trouble was, he had no way to say any of that to a living soul. No proof yet that would make the saying worth the breath. He was 13. A boy of 13 who walks into his father's kitchen and announces that he has overheard the family's ruin and means to hold it off with a row of leafless sticks is a boy who will be sent to bed and watched with worry for a month. He understood that much about grown men already. A warning nobody can act on is only a weight passed from one set of shoulders to another, and his father's shoulders were carrying enough. So he said nothing, and he planted instead, which was a language of its own, one the boy trusted further than words. The bend of Coldwater Creek was the place the willows would matter most. So the bend was the stretch he set the thickest whip crowded against whip, each one pressed deep and firm down hard with his weight behind it. Nobody driving past could have told the good ground from the poor, or a boy's fool errand from the quiet holding of a line drawn against ruin. Toby preferred it that way. A thing done for show can be argued with. A thing done in silence only has to work. The weather came to test the willows the way that country tests everything green in it, without mercy on its own schedule. There is a stretch of the central Kentucky winter when the cold takes on a personal quality, when the frost drives down past the reach of any root, and the wind comes off the ridgelines with an edge that hunts out the one weak seam in a man's coat. That first winter came in hard as any the boy could remember. A freeze in the last week of January dropped the mercury below zero 2 nights running the water bucket in the barn, skinned over with ice by morning, the ground ringing hard as a skillet underfoot. When the thaw finally loosed its grip, Toby walked the bank in the gray melt and found a full third of his whips gone black, and brittle killed clean down into the mud, snapping off at a touch like burnt matchsticks. The loss landed on him with a weight out of all proportion to its size, because a third of his stand meant a third of a summer's hay money spent to feed the frost, and because it was the first hard proof that Merle Colfax and every laughing voice at the feed store counter might have called it right after all. He said nothing of it to his father. He went instead out to the barn where he had rooted a spare bucket of cuttings in creek water, against exactly this loss the way the booklet said a careful man always should hedge your stand against the winter. One raw Saturday he replanted every dead gap along the line, driving the new whips a full hand's width deeper than the first, working the frozen clay tight around each stem, until the cold of it ached up through his boots into the bone. His brother watched a while from the fence, breath fogging. "You do understand they're only trees, don't you? That creek's fixing to do exactly what it means to do willows in the bank or no willows." Toby did not raise his eyes from the work. Some things cannot be explained to a person who has never lain awake over papers and liberty. He did not attempt it. Spring extended him no kindness either. The tender new growth broke green in May, soft and hopeful. And inside a week, the aphids found it thousands upon thousands of the small green bodies clustered thick along every fresh shoot, drinking the life out of the leaves before they had fairly unrolled. Toby treated what he could reach with the little he could afford, a weak wash of dish soap mixed in a hand sprayer, bought secondhand, working it over the leaves at dawn before the heat set the pests moving. He saved the better part of the stand that way. Some he lost regardless, the leaves crisping brown at the margins, curling, dropping, until a stretch of the whips stood bare a second time inside a single year. Merle Colfax rolled by on the county road in the warm heart of June, took in the patchy, laboring line of green, shook his head in a slow arc. "Might as well have set out a row of broom handles, son, and saved yourself the stooping." He said it without any meanness at all, which somehow drove it deeper because a man is only that gentle over a thing he has already buried in his own mind. There were evenings that first summer when Toby stood alone at the bend in the low gold light and asked himself whether Merle had the right of it after all. The whips that had lived through the freeze came back pencil thin, slow gaining maybe a foot of height, where a hardy stem ought to have gained 3, looking less like the beginning of a living wall than the tag ends of a failed idea. A dry spell in the depths of August pulled the creek down to a sullen green thread and cracked the exposed clay of the bank into a crazed web like the glaze on old pottery. 2 of the saplings nearest the bend simply quit browning from the tip downward across a single week, no matter how many buckets of creek water the boy hauled to their roots by hand at dusk. He pulled the dead ones, set fresh cuttings in the wounds they left deeper again, refusing to let himself tally how many times over he had now planted the same short stretch of failing ground. What held him to the work was not the mule-headed stubbornness the road saw in him. It was that he could see when he knelt close and worked his fingers down into the cool mud around a living stem, that the roots had commenced to do the very thing his grandfather had promised over that ruined gully. Beneath the struggling, unimpressive top growth out of sight of every man who laughed, the willows were reaching down. He would loosen the soil at the base of a survivor and find the pale threads already run wide, already gripping, already lacing sideways into the body of the bank the way the booklet's diagrams had drawn them. The part that mattered was the part no eye could see from the road. He came to feel kneeling there in the mud, with the evidence cool between his fingers, that this was the truest thing the willows had to teach a person, truer even than the science of it. The work that saves you is the work done underground in the dark, long before the water ever rises to test whether you did it well. A man is judged by what holds when the flood comes, not by what shows while the weather is fair. That was the shape of the first year. Frost, aphid, drought, the slow ache of a labor no one believed in the private and unshowable evidence that it might against every laughing voice be working. Toby turned 14 somewhere in the middle of it, without much notice from anyone. The willows a little taller, a little tougher still, a joke to the county and still a secret to the boy who tended them. He might have carried on that way another year in peace, the weather. His only enemy had a different kind of trouble, not come walking down to the water on a still afternoon near the close of that season. Wade Colfax was Merle's younger brother by better than a decade, and where Merle had gone gray and easy in his ways, content to farm his stretch of the creek the way their father had before them, Wade carried a hungrier cast in him. He had come back to Casey County after some years away that the family did not discuss in front of company, and once returned he had taken to running Merle's place more than helping with it, his eye forever traveling the fence lines, forever measuring who held what, and precisely where the lines between them lay. The best of the Colfax bottom, like the Renfrews, sat cradled in the crook of Coldwater Creek. For 100 years the two families had shared that crook, the whole length of it, without a single crossword, each man working his own side, the running water the only boundary either had ever needed or claimed. Wade did not see it in that peaceable light. He had gotten it lodged in his skull from some yellowed plat map in a courthouse drawer, or from the plain force of his own wanting, that the true line ran not down the center of the creek at all, but well over onto the Renfrew side, that a good rich acre of Renfrew bottom was by rights. Colfax ground held these long years in error. He had said as much across his own brother's supper table, and Merle had told him to let it lie, that the Renfrews were decent people, that the creek had run where it ran since their grandfathers were boys. But letting a thing lie was not in the make of Wade Colfax. It never had been. He came down to the water that still afternoon while Toby knelt at his work, and he stood a long spell on the far bank, watching the boy press a fresh cutting into the mud, saying nothing, letting his silence do a kind of work of its own. There was a thing in his face the boy did not care for, even before the man spoke a slow calculation behind the eyes, the look of someone pacing off ground he has already decided to have. "That's an awful lot of trouble to spend," he called across at last, the words easy enough, riding on the surface, "setting out all them trees on dirt that might not prove to be yours to plant." Toby straightened slow out of his crouch. He was 14, thin as the willows he tended, a head shorter than the man across the water. He did not drop his eyes. "It's my daddy's ground. Been my daddy's ground 100 years, and his daddy's before that." Wade smiled at the answer, and the smile found no warm place in his face to settle. 100 years don't count for much against a fresh survey, son. Lines get set right times. Ground changes hands quieter than folks think. Water moves. His gaze traveled the length of the thickening green stand, the young willows leaning their new growth toward the current, and something shifted behind his eyes as he looked some private reckoning of what those trees might one day be worth, what they might one day hold together that he would sooner see fall apart. He turned then, without another word, walked back up the slope toward the Colfax place, unhurried a man and no doubt of his own patience. Toby stood a while in the shallows after he had gone, the cold creek running over the toes of his boots, and he understood without being told that Wade Colfax had not come down to the water to talk about surveys at all. He had come to look at the willows. Whatever he had seen in them, he had not liked, and a man who does not like a thing that stands in the way of what he wants is a man who will, given time and no witnesses, find some means of removing it. The boy filed the man's face away behind his eyes, alongside the loose staples, in the slow-draining corners, and the killdeer's habits, one more shift in the weather of his small world, the most dangerous he had marked yet. He did not know how right he was to fear it. He only knew, walking home in the failing light with the creek at his back, that the trouble on that bank had stopped being a thing the weather made and become a thing a man intended. He did not carry it to his father that night. He asked himself many times in the seasons that followed whether he ought to have. But Owen had come in gray-faced off a telephone call from the bank in Liberty, the note on the south field pressing closer than the family let itself say aloud, and Della had laid a hand on her husband's shoulder at the sink that spoke more than any sentence could, and Toby judged in the practiced way a quiet child reads the weather of a house, that there was no room at that table for a boy's dark feeling about a neighbor's face. He carried it alone instead, the way he had learned to carry everything folded down small behind his eyes, where no one would think to look. He did not yet know how much he would have to carry, nor how much would ride, when the water finally came on a line of willows no one but a boy had ever believed in. The second winter came on gentler than the first, which should have been a mercy, but felt to Toby more like a held breath. The freeze that arrived in December did not drive below zero, did not blacken the whips or snap them off at the mud, and by the time the ground softened in the false warmth of a February thaw, The boy walked his line and found nearly the whole of it living, the survivors of the first year gone woody. At the base thickened past the width of his thumb, their bark taking on the reddish cast that told him the roots below were doing their patient underground work. He knelt at the largest of them, the one nearest the bend, worked his fingers into the cold earth around its foot, felt the mat of roots run out wide beneath his hand like the fingers of something buried that meant to stay. For the first time since he had pressed the first stick into the frost, he let himself believe the thing might hold. That belief did not last the season out. Belief in that country rarely did, the land being what it was, the people being who they were, a neighbor's want being a force no less real than the weather. The willows had grown enough by that second spring to be seen plainly from the Colfax side of the creek, a green thickening line where 2 years before there had been only bare sticks and laughter, and a green line that held a bank together was a green line that stood in the way of a man who needed that bank to fail. Toby did not think of it in those terms yet. He was 14 going on 15, and he still believed the way the young do, that a thing done rightly is a thing let alone. He would be taught otherwise before the year turned. Wade Colfax had not come down to the water again after that first still afternoon, but Toby marked him at the fence lines more often now at odd hours on foot, where a man had no cause to be on foot, standing at the top of the far slope, with his hands in his pockets, looking down at the creek the way a buyer looks at a horse he has already decided to underpay for. The boy took to glancing up from his work to find the man simply there, a shape against the tree line gone, by the time Toby had straightened to look square at him. It unsettled him in a way he could not have justified to his father across the supper table, because a man is allowed to stand on his own ground, is allowed to look at a creek that runs past his own bottom. There was no crime in watching. Toby only knew that the watching had a weight to it, a purpose behind the eyes, and that purpose was not neighborly. The first blow fell in the middle of April, on a morning that gave no warning of it. Toby came down to the water before the bus the way he always did, expecting nothing worse than the ordinary work of the season, and found ruin along 30 feet of his best bank. The cattle had been through it. The Renfrew herd, or some part of it, had come down off the high pasture in the night and worked the soft creek edge into a churned wallow of hoofprints and torn mud, and where the willows had stood thickest in the very stretch nearest the bend that the boy had tended most carefully, better than a dozen of the young trees lay snapped and trampled into the muck, their roots torn half out of the bank, their reddish bark scored white where 1,000 pounds of animal had ground them under. The boy stood over the wreck of 2 years' labor with a cold sickness rising in him, the kind that comes before anger has found its feet. A dozen willows, the stretch that mattered most at the bend where the good ground of the south field lay closest to the water's reach. He did not curse. He did not throw down his spade. He did the thing he always did, the thing that made him what he was. He looked. He knelt in the torn mud and studied how the cattle had gotten in, because cattle do not open a gate for themselves nor climb a standing fence. And a boy who had found a loose staple 3 days ahead of trouble was not a boy to accept a ruin without asking how the ruin had come to be. The temporary fencing he had strung along the top of the bank, 3 strands of smooth wire on locust posts he had set himself, was down in one place. One place only, a single clean gap, the width of a gate, through which the whole disaster had funneled. Toby ran the wire through his fingers to the break, expecting to find what he had always found before a staple worked loose by frost. Heave a strand rusted through the honest failures of honest material. That was not what his fingers found. The wire had not pulled loose. It had not rusted. It had been cut and cut clean, the ends of it sheared square and bright. The bright metal of a fresh cut that no weather had yet had time to dull snip through with a tool made for the purpose by a hand that meant it. He knew the difference between a wire that has failed and a wire that has been made to fail. There is no mistaking the one for the other once you have held both. He crouched there a long while over the bright cut ends, the school bus grinding past unseen on the road above, missed for the first time in his life, while the whole shape of it assembled itself behind his eyes. Someone had come in the night. Someone had cut his fence in the one place that would let the herd down onto the one stretch of bank that mattered most. Someone had known enough about willows, about creeks, about what the boy was doing down here in the mud, that the county laughed at to know precisely where the cutting would do the most harm. That narrowed the field of who to a number a boy could count on. The fingers of one hand, and at the head of that short count stood a man who watched from the far slope, with his hands in his pockets, A man who had told him to his face that lines move, that ground changes hands quieter than folks think. Toby said nothing of the cut wire to his father that night, though the not saying cost him. He had learned the price of a boy's accusation carried to a grown man's table without a witness to stand behind it. Owen Renfrew was a fair man, the fairest Toby knew. But fairness cuts two ways, and a fair man does not brand a neighbor a criminal on the strength of his boy's certainty about the shear of a wire. There would be questions the boy could not answer. Did you see him do it? Did anyone see him? Could the cattle not have pushed the wire till it parted? And to each question, Toby had only the same answer, that he had seen no one. That no one had seen anything, that he knew the difference between a broken wire and a cut. One, the way he knew the difference between a live willow and a dead one, by the plain evidence of it in his hand, which was no evidence at all to a court or a co-op, or a father trying to keep peace with the man whose fence ran alongside his own. So he swallowed it. He mended the fence himself that evening, ran a fourth strand where there had been three, drove the staples deep, doubled the posts at the gap. He salvaged what willows he could, replanting the trampled survivors whose roots still held a thread of life, cutting fresh whips from his barn stock for the ones past saving, pressing them into the churned ground deeper than ever, firming each one down until full dark drove him up to the house. He worked in a silence that had a new quality to it, no longer the easy quiet of a boy, content in his labor, but the harder silence of one who has understood that his labor has an enemy, and that the enemy has a face, and that he cannot speak the face aloud. Garrett found him at it as the last light went, and leaned on the new doubled post. You know, a smart man would have quit after the freeze took the first third. A smarter one after the bugs took the next. His brother's voice held no cruelty, only the honest bafflement of a practical boy watching an impractical one throw good work after bad. Now the cattle have had at him too. At some point, Toby, the good Lord, and the whole of Casey County are trying to tell you something. Toby drove a staple home before he answered the ring of the hammer flat in the wet air. The cattle didn't get in on their own. He said no more than that. He watched to see what his brother would make of it. Garrett made nothing of it, took it for a boy's excuse, a way of dodging the plain arithmetic of failure. Fence gave, fences give, that's what they do. He walked back up toward the house, shaking his head, and Toby let him go because he had learned that a truth without a witness is a kind of loneliness, and he was learning to bear it. The cut wire changed the boy in ways his family marked without understanding. He took to walking the bank at odd hours now, not the easy Sunday round of before, but a harder patrol, first light and full dark, both sometimes rising in the deep of the night to stand at his window, looking down toward the black line of the creek, listening for what he could not have named. He set his salvaged willows, and he guarded them, a 14-year-old boy, mounting a watch over 120 yards of muddy bank against a grown man he could not prove existed in the dark. And the strain of it hollowed his face, put a wariness in him where there had been only quiet. Della noticed her son had stopped sleeping the night through. She said nothing at first in the family way, but she watched him across the breakfast table with a mother's particular fear, the fear of a trouble in a child that the child will not name. Wade Colfax came past the Renfrew place on the road that week, slowed his truck at the mailbox, the way a man does who has nowhere he needs to be, looked long down the drive toward the creek. Toby was in the yard splitting stovewood, and he straightened with the maul in his hands and met the man's look across the distance, and neither of them spoke, and neither of them needed to. The boy understood in the plain, wordless grammar of that country that the man was telling him something. I can reach it whenever I please. I can come in the night, and you cannot stop me, and you cannot prove me. Give it up. Let the bank fall. And Toby understood too, standing there with the maul in his blistered hands, that he was answering. No, it stays. I'll set them back faster than you can tear them out. He did not know where the resolve came from in him, a thin boy against a grown man's patience and malice, except that it came from the same place his father's tiredness came from, the same place the papers and liberty came from, 4 generations of ground held against every force that meant to take it, and he was not going to be the Renfrew who let the water in. The second sabotage came in May, subtler than the first, and it told him the man had learned from the failure of the fence. There was no torn ground this time, no trampled trees, nothing a father could be shown, even had the boy dared to show him. Toby only came down one morning to find a stretch of his youngest cuttings, the ones set to replace the trampled dozen gone limp and yellowing, though they had been thriving the week before, and when he knelt to work them loose, he found the reason. Someone had pulled each one part way from the ground in the night, just enough to break the fine new roots, just enough to lift the stem, so the delicate root hairs lost their grip on the soil, then pressed each back into place so the damage would not show until the plant began to die. It was a thing only a man who understood willows would think to do, a slow murder disguised as natural failure. And it enraged Toby past anything the cutwire had, because it was patient, because it was clever, because it was meant to make him doubt himself, to make him believe his own trees were simply failing on their own, the way the whole county already believed they would. He knelt in the mud that morning with a dying willow in his two hands, and felt something in him harden, past the reach of any argument. This was the low place, though he did not have the word for it, then the bottom of the long trench the seasons had dug in him. Frost that had blackened his stand, aphids that had stripped it bare, drought that had cracked the bank under it. A dozen trees ground under the hooves of his own herd led in through a cut fence. Now this, the quiet lifting of his youngest and most hopeful plantings done in the dark, by a man who could not be named, could not be caught, could not be spoken of at the supper table, without the boy sounding to his own family, like a child inventing enemies to explain his failures. He had done everything right. He had done the work underground where it counted, the work his grandfather taught him, the work that was supposed to save you. And a man's want, a man's patient malice could undo in a night what a season built. There is a thing that happens to a person in that low place, and it happened to Toby that spring, kneeling in the creek mud with the murdered willow going soft in his hands. He could have quit. Every voice he had ever heard on the matter, his brothers Merle Colfax's the whole, laughing counties, told him quitting was the sane thing, the arithmetic thing, the thing a smart man does when the ground has told him plainly enough that it will not be held. He knelt there a long time with the quitting available to him, warm and easy as a door standing open. Then he pressed the dying willow back into the mud, firmed the soil around its broken roots with a tenderness that had nothing left of a boy's whim in it, went to the barn for fresh cuttings, and began again. Not because he believed it would work. He was past the simple believing of the first year. He began again because the alternative was to hand a man in the dark the thing 4 generations had held in the light, and that he would not do, believe or not. He changed his tactics after that the way his grandfather had changed 100 failing banks, by watching what failed and answering it. If the man came in the dark, the boy would make the dark less friendly to him. Toby ran a line of empty tin cans on wire between the locust posts, so a hand parting the fence in the night would set them clattering. He took to sleeping in the barn on the worst-feeling nights, a horse blanket over the straw, the loft window giving him a gray view of the creek line, waking at every sound the old building made in the wind. He rooted more cuttings than he could ever need, banks of them in buckets along the barn wall, so that whatever the man tore out in the night, the boy could set back double by dusk. It was not a fair fight, a boy against a man, a watch against a patience, but Toby had never asked for fair. He had only asked to hold the line, and holding a line, he was learning, is not a thing you do once. It is a thing you do every day, against every force that means to move it until the day the line is tested for real, and you find out whether all you're holding was worth a thing. The willows, for their part, did not know they had an enemy. They went on doing what willows do. The survivors thickening through that second summer, their roots running wider and deeper with every week. The boy managed to keep them in the ground, so that even as Wade Colfax pulled a few in the night, Toby set more, and the net beneath the bank grew despite the man grew, because the boy refused to let a single gap stand open more than a day. By the deep of that second summer, the stand along Coldwater Creek had become, against every prediction, a true thing, a green wall trailing its long leaves in the current. When the water ran full, its roots laced sideways through the bank. In a mat a boy could feel, pull taut against his hand when he tested it. Merle Colfax rolled past on the road one July afternoon, slowed, looked long at the green line he had once called a row of broom handles, and did not say anything at all. The silence of a man who has stopped being certain is its own kind of testimony. That was the summer the drought bore down hardest, the driest anyone in that country could bring to mind. The creek fell all through July into a sullen green thread. The pastures cured brown on the hoof. Men at the co-op talked in the flat, beaten register farmers use for a season already lost, and Owen Renfrew sold off 6 head he had meant to keep through the winter, taking the low summer price, because he could not afford the hay to carry them. And Toby watched what the selling cost his father, though. Owen let no complaint pass his lips. The papers down in Liberty did not care that the rain had failed. They came due on their own schedule, indifferent as the sky. The boy did his willow work in the dawn cool, now hauling creek water by the bucket to the youngest of his plantings, keeping alive by hand what the drought and the man between them meant to kill. And there were mornings the labor felt like carrying water to the dead. So still and low and hopeless did the whole bottom lie under the white summer sun. Wade Colfax made his boldest move in the worst of that dry spell, and it was the move that finally told Toby how far the man was prepared to go. The creek being low, its bed near dry in places, a person could walk the very channel where in a wet year the current would have run 4 feet deep. And one August evening, Toby came down at dusk to find fresh boot prints in the cracked mud of the stream bed, itself running the length of his willow line, and at 3 separate places along the bank, the earth had been dug into at the base of his largest trees, the soil pulled away from the roots to bear them to the killing sun. An act of such deliberate understanding, such precise malice that the boy stood over it with his heart going hard in his chest. The man had learned the willows well enough now to attack them where they lived. Expose the roots in a drought, and the sun does your murder for you, slow, natural-looking, impossible to lay at any man's door. Toby knelt in the dry channel and packed the soil back over the bared roots with his bare hands, working in the last light. And this time the cold in him was not sickness and was not quite anger, was something steadier and more dangerous than either the settled cold of a boy who has understood his enemy fully and decided past all fear not to lose. He looked at the boot prints running the length of his line, the prints of a grown man's boot walking the dry bed of a creek to murder a boy's trees 1 root at a time, and he spoke aloud to the empty bottom low, the only words he wasted on it. You don't understand what you're fighting. He was not sure himself in the moment whether he meant the man did not understand the willows or the boy or the water that would one day come. It would prove true of all 3. He carried this too alone as he had carried the rest, though the carrying had worn a groove in him by now that his family could see, even if they could not read it. Della cornered him in the barn one evening in September, having watched her 3rd child go gaunt and sleepless across the summer, having marked the way he flinched at sounds in the night, the way he had stopped being merely quiet and become watchful, guarded older in the eyes than a boy his age had any business being. Whatever it is you're carrying down at that creek, she said, her voice pitched low and even, the voice she used for a hurt animal or a frightened child. You don't have to carry it by yourself. That's what a family's for, to help hold the heavy thing. Toby looked at his mother a long moment in the lantern light, the buckets of rooted cuttings ranked along the wall behind him, the evidence of his war stacked in plain sight had she known how to read it. He almost told her then. The whole of it rose in his throat, the cut wire and the pulled roots and the bared trees and the boot prints in the dry bed, the man on the far slope with his hands in his pockets, the whole 2 years' weight of it. He swallowed it back down, not because he did not trust his mother, but because he understood with a wisdom that cost him something. To have earned so young that to speak it now without proof would only spread the weight. Without lightning, it would set his father against the neighbor with nothing but a boy's word to stand on, would turn a quiet war. He was against all odds, holding into an open one. He might lose. It's just a drought, Mama, he said, and the lie sat sour in his mouth. Hard on the trees, that's all. Della held his eyes a moment longer, and in that moment, they both knew it for a lie, and both knew why he told it. And something passed between mother and son that was its own kind of understanding, harder and lonelier than the truth would have been. She touched his cheek once with the back of her hand the way she had when he was small and feverish, and left him to his buckets in his watch. A mother knows when a child has taken a man's burden onto a boy's shoulders. She does not always know how to take it back off. The rains broke in the 2nd week of October, and they broke the way that country least expects, not with the wall of water a summer thunderstorm brings, but with a low-gray patience, a soaking rain that fell day upon day, filling the drought-cracked ground until the cracks closed and swelled, and the earth could hold no more, and then having filled the ground, beginning to fill the creeks. Toby marked the change in the water before any man in the county spoke of it, because he was the one who walked the bank at dawn and dusk, the one who knew the creek's ordinary voice well enough to hear when it changed. Cold water rose out of its drought thread day by day, greened, browned, quickened until by the fourth day of rain it ran deep and fast, and the color of steeped coffee shouldering against the very banks the boy had spent 2 years learning to defend, carrying whole branches past in a current that had teeth in it again after a summer of having none. The signs came to him the way signs always came plainly to a boy who had trained himself his whole short life to read them. The killdeer told him first. The little gravel-nesting birds that fed each day along the low creek margin had moved their feeding uphill, taking their fledged young up out of the bottom to the safety of the high pasture 3 full days before the worst of the rain arrived, as though some older knowledge in their blood had read a coming water the barometer had not yet found. Toby watched them go and understood what their going meant. The birds that lived by the creek did not trust the creek. They were leaving the low ground. A boy who had learned to distrust nothing the animals told him packed that knowing away with a cold certainty settling into his gut. The water was coming, and it was coming big. Old Clyde Dunmore, who farmed the bottomland 2 miles east and carried 80 years behind him to measure a rain against, told Owen at the co-op that cold water was running higher than he had witnessed since the Great Water of 1993. The flood that was still 30 years on the yardstick every man in that country laid a high creek against. Clyde did not say a thing like that to hear himself talk. When a man with 80 years in the bottom tells you the water is the highest since the year of the Great Flood, the wise ones nail their advisories to the barn door and move their stock uphill. Owen came home gray from the co-op and walked his own banks in the last failing light of that fourth wet day, and the creek he found was not the drought thread of August. It ran deep and swift and dangerous, and he stood over the boy's willow line a long moment in the rain. The fool project he had neither praised nor forbidden across 2 hard years, and Toby, watching from the crown of the rise, could not read what moved across his father's face in the wet dusk. The county issued its flood advisory that afternoon, and Owen took the printed sheet down from the board at the co-op and nailed it to the barn door where the whole family would pass it, a square of gray paper going soft already in the damp. Its official words, a small human answer to a thing no words could hold back. They ate their supper that night quiet under the drum of the rain on the tin roof, each of them turning private thoughts. Nora asked Small whether the house would be all right, and Owen told her the house sat high and had sat high through worse, which was true, though it was not the house he lay awake over. It was the bottom. It was the south field cradled in the crook of the creek, the dark loam his grandfather had built up across a lifetime, the papers in liberty that would come due whether the water took the ground or spared it. He did not say any of that at the table. He did not have to. Toby heard the whole of it in the spaces between his father's plain words, the way he heard most things in the silence around the speaking. Late that night, when the house had gone dark and the rain kept on without pause, Toby left his bed, pulled on his boots, took the lantern down to the creek in the streaming dark. He could not have said what drew him, except that a man who has fought 2 years for a line does not sleep easy the night the line is finally to be tested. He walked the willow stand end to end in the rain, the lantern throwing wild shadows. The creek, a black roaring thing below the bank, now higher than he had ever seen it, gnawing at the edges of the world he had planted. At the bend where the good ground lay closest and the willows stood thickest, he knelt in the mud and pressed the flat of his hand against the trunk of the largest tree. The first survivor, the one he had tended through frost and aphid and drought, and a man's malice both, and beneath the streaming bark, he felt the whole living structure of it, drawn taut as a ship's rigging in a gale, the roots pulling tight down in the flooding earth like cables coming under a load they were built to carry. The tree knew what was coming. It had spent 2 years getting ready in the dark where the readying counts. So had the boy. He stayed a while at the bend in the rain with his hand on the tree, past sense, past comfort. A 15-year-old boy alone with a lantern between a rising creek and everything his family stood to lose. He thought of Wade Colfax somewhere up in the dark on his own high ground dry, and waiting a man who had spent a summer trying to tear this line out one root at a time so the water could finish what his want began. He thought of the papers in Liberty and the tiredness in his father's shoulders and the long arithmetic of 4 generations against one flood. He thought of his grandfather standing over a ruined gully in the last light telling a boy that the water meets the roots, and for once in its life the water is the thing that loses. All of it, the whole 2 years of frost and doubt and murder in the dark and lonely holding, came down now to a simple question the rising creek would answer for him before the night was through. A question no argument could settle. No witness was needed to prove. Would it hold? He rose, took up his lantern, climbed the bank toward the house through the streaming dark, and left the willows to the water because there was nothing left for a boy to do but let the creek come and learn what 2 years in the dark had made. The rain did not let up in the night. It came on through the dark hours, steady as a drum, with no drummer, no thunder to break it, no wind to turn it. Only the patient falling of it on the tin roof over the sleeping house and on the black water rising in the bottom. And Toby lay in his bed above it all, with his boots still on, listening the way a man listens for a sound he dreads and needs to hear both at once. He did not sleep. He had not expected to. Sometime past 3, the quality of the creek's voice changed. Below the house deepened, took on a low, continuous roar, where before there had been only the rush of fast water, and the boy knew without rising to look that cold water had come out of its banks somewhere upstream, that the thing 2 years in the making had finally arrived to test what he had built against it. It came on a Thursday night, and by the gray of Friday morning, the creek had jumped its channel in 4 places along the 2-mile run between the Colfax Bottom and the Prentice Place to the east. Toby was down the stairs and out the door at first light, his father already ahead of him, pulling on his coat, the two of them going down toward the water through a rain that had finally begun to slacken, and what they found at the bottom of the rise stopped them both. The world Toby had known there was gone under a moving brown sheet. Where the low margin of the south pasture had been, there was now the creek itself spread wide and flat, and the color of plowed earth carrying branches and fence rails, and the drowned rack of the whole valley passed in a current that did not hurry because it did not need to, having already won everything it meant to take. They walked the high edge of the bottom in the wet dawn, father and son, and the damage revealed itself to them a piece at a time as the light came up, and it was worse than either had let himself expect through the long night. Along the whole 2 miles, the creek had been at its old work of taking, and it had taken with a will. But Toby's eyes went first past his own bank, past his own trees, to the place where he already feared the worst would show, and the worst showed. Downstream, where the Colfax Bottom met the water at the very stretch Wade had spent a summer trying to clear of willows, the bank was simply gone. Not damaged. Gone. A raw new edge cut 10 feet back into what had been the richest Colfax ground. The dark bottomland soil peeled away in the night and carried off downstream, the pasture grass that had held it hanging now in torn mats over a bare vertical face of clay. The very acre Wade Colfax had claimed by survey, the acre he meant to take. The acre he had bared the roots and cut the fence and walked the dry creek bed by night to win the water, had taken it from him entire while he slept dry on his high ground. Toby stood looking at the ruin of the Colfax bank a long moment, and what rose in him was not triumph. He was too much his grandfather's grandson for triumph over a neighbor's loss, even a neighbor who had earned it. What rose in him was a cold and level understanding of the thing his grandfather had told him over a ruined gully. 2 summers gone, the thing the whole county had laughed at the thing. A man had spent a season of malice trying to prove false. The water meets the roots, and for once the water loses. Wade Colfax had spent his summer making certain the water would meet no roots at all along his bank, that nothing would stand in the current's way when it came. The current had come, met nothing, and taken everything. A man who fights the water head-on with a bare bank and a hard heart loses all at once in the night while he sleeps. The boy had been told exactly this. He had simply been the only one who listened. Merle Colfax lost 60 feet of his north pasture bank in the same night further up where the creek took a bend against his ground, and Toby would see the old man standing over it later that day, hands slack at his sides, looking at the raw new edge where his fence had run the morning before topsoil. His father and grandfather had tended, carried off in brown sheets to Tennessee, just as he had once warned the boy his willows would be. 3 of the Prentice fence lines were down the posts and wire tangled in a raft of flood rack, 200 yards downstream, wrapped around the trunk of a sycamore that had held where the fences had not. The low road between the farms ran a foot deep in moving water and would not clear until Saturday. Old Clyde Dunmore, 2 miles east, lost the better part of a hay meadow he had spent a dozen years building up out of poor ground into good the dark, loose soil of it, taken fast by a water that knew loose soil for the easy meal it was. And Clyde would stand at the edge of what the flood had left him that Friday afternoon, with his hands driven deep in his pockets, saying nothing at all for a long time. An old man doing sums in his head that would not come out to anything but loss. But on the Renfrew place at the bend of Coldwater Creek, along the 120 yards, a boy had planted and tended and guarded through 2 years of frost and drought. And a man's patient malice, the creek had stayed close to its channel. Not perfectly. The water had spread into the low edge of the south pasture, the way water will had risen up over the boys' willows, until only their crowns showed above the brown flood, had shouldered against the bank with the full weight of a 2-mile head of water behind it. But the bank itself, the long stretch where the willow stood, had held. Where the Colfax ground showed a raw, vertical face of bared clay, the Renfrew bank showed willow. The trees stood half-drowned, bent nearly flat under the current, their leaves streaming downstream in the brown water like the hair of something swimming, mud-scoured, whipped, battered past anything a person would call thriving. But they stood. Their roots, exposed in places where the flood had scoured the softer surface soil away, gripped the bank still laced through it, held it a living net, drawn taut against a force that had torn clean through every bare bank for 2 miles in either direction. Toby and his father stood at the top of the rise, looking down at it in the gray Friday light. The boys' 2 years of labor half drowned but standing the good ground of the south field behind it, dark and whole and unmoved, while the water raged past its edge. And for a long moment, neither of them found a word. It was Owen who broke the silence at last. Owen, the spare man who spent no word, he did not have to, and what he said low, looking not at his son, but down at the willows bent under the flood. I never once told you to stop. A pause, the rain thinning to a mist around them. I never told you to keep on either. I should have. I should have seen what you saw. Toby did not answer. There are moments a boy waits years to hear come out of a father's mouth, and when they come at last, he learns that the right answer to them is silence, is standing beside the man and looking at the thing they have both finally understood. The creek roared past below. The willows held. The south field, the dark loam of 4 generations, the ground the papers in Liberty had a claim on, stayed where his great-grandfather had built it. That was the whole of the answer, and it needed no words from the boy to complete it. The roots had done in the one night that counted exactly what the old man had promised they would, over that ruined gully 2 summers before, and there was nothing left to explain about it, that the bank did not now say plainer than any booklet. It was not a miracle. Toby knew better than to call it that. It was 2 years of patient work in the dark, tested in a single night and proven. Nobody made a speech about it. That was not the way of that country, and it was not the way of the boy who had done the thing. The willows spoke for themselves, standing where every other bank had fallen, and there was no need for a Renfrew to add a word to what a bent and living tree already said plain to any man with eyes to read a flooded bottom. The rain quit entirely by Friday afternoon. The water began its slow fall over Saturday, drawing back off the low pasture, revealing as it went the full ledger of the night, who had held and who had lost, written in raw clay and torn sod the length of the valley. Toby walked his bank on Saturday as the water dropped, straightening the willows that could be straightened packing soil, back over the roots the flood had bared, and where every other man in the bottom worked at the grief of repair, of fencing off ruin, of measuring what the water had stolen. The boy worked at the smaller and stranger task of tending a thing that had won. Merle Colfax came across on the Monday following boots still caked with the mud of his own ruined pasture, and Toby watched him come down the rise, slow an old man crossing to look at a thing he had once called a row of broom handles. He stood at the edge of the Renfrew bank a long while saying nothing, looking at the mud-scoured willows standing where his own bank had washed to Tennessee, and Toby stood a little apart and let him look, because he understood that the man was doing a hard sum in his head, the sum of a thing he had been sure of for 2 years turning out to be wrong, and that a sum like that takes a man a while to finish. When Merle finally spoke, he did not begin with an apology, because men of his make do not, and Toby did not need one. Where'd you come by them willows? That was all. The whole of the reckoning folded into a plain question about a nursery. Toby told him the name of the place upstate, wrote it down on a scrap of paper he had in his pocket, and Merle took the scrap in his mud-stained fingers and folded it once and put it away in his shirt pocket, and the putting away of that scrap was the loudest thing said in the whole valley that week. An old man does not carry home the name of a thing he still thinks a fool's errand. What Merle Colfax did not speak of, what no man in that valley spoke of directly in the days after the water fell, was his brother. Wade did not come down to look at the Renfrew Bank, not on the Monday, not in the weeks that followed. He had lost the very acre he had spent a summer scheming to take. Lost it not to a survey or a court, but to the plain water he had tried to clear a path for, and there is no answering a loss like that. No man to sue, no fence to mend, that will bring the ground back. The dark bottomland that had been the heart of his want was gone downstream, mixed now into some sandbar 10 miles south, and the boy whose trees he had cut and pulled and bared in the night stood on a whole and unmoved bank 100 yards upstream of the raw wound in the earth where the Colfax ground used to be. Toby never learned whether the man understood the shape of what had happened to him, whether he ever once connected the summer he had spent trying to strip a bank of its willows to the winter he spent looking at the raw new edge those willows might have held. The boy suspected he did not. A man who fights the water head-on rarely understands even at the end that the water was never the thing he was truly fighting. The survey claim died with the flood, though no lawyer ever pronounced it dead. Wade had built his whole case for the disputed acre on the line of the old creek bank, the bank that had run there in his grandfather's time. And now that bank was gone, scoured 10 feet back into ground, he could no longer claim was his. And a boundary argument that rests on a bank the water has carried off is an argument that has lost its own foundation to the very force the claimant refused to guard against. There was nothing left to survey. The line Wade had sworn ran under the Renfrew side now ran, if it ran anywhere, through open water, in a raw clay face and a memory of ground that no longer existed. Owen Renfrew, who had lain awake over that claim through the summer alongside his worry about the papers and liberty, learned in the falling of the flood that the trouble had settled itself in a night that the neighbor's want had been answered by the same water it tried to use, and that his son had stood between his family and that water without once being asked to. The South Field was the thing that mattered most in the end, and the South Field was saved. When the assessor came out from the bank in Liberty that spring to walk the Renfrew ground, the way the bank's men did in those years, with any farm carrying a note, he found the bottomland whole, the good dark loam intact behind a bank that had held through the worst water since '93 while every neighbor's ground had washed. A farm that holds its best ground through a flood that ruins its neighbors is a farm the bank looks at differently, and though no one ever drew a straight line from a boy's willows to the terms his father was able to make on the South Field that year, Owen drew the line himself privately in the place a man keeps his deepest accounts. He knew what had held his ground. He knew who had held it. He had watched from the top of the rise for 2 years while a son did in silence the thing that saved them all. And if he never found the full words for it, he found the smaller ways a spare man has of saying a large thing. The hand on the shoulder, the second helping pushed across the table. The chores lightened without comment so the boy would have his hours at the creek. Toby, for his part, never told a living soul that he had known it would hold. He did not need to, and it was not in him to. The bank said it for him, plainer than any bow standing green and rooted where the water had torn everything else away. And a boy who has learned to trust the plain evidence of a thing over the noise men make about it does not undo that lesson by making noise of his own. When Garrett, who had told him he was throwing good work after bad, stood at the mended bank that spring and allowed grudging, that maybe there was something to the willows after all, Toby only nodded because a man who has been proven right by the water has no need to be proven right by his brother's mouth. When the men at the feed store who had chewed over his fool project for 2 years fell quiet on the subject, or worse, began to speak of it as though they had seen the sense in it all along, the boy let them because he had never done the thing for their seeing, and their not seeing had cost him nothing he could not afford, and their seeing now cost him nothing either. The Willows did their slow spreading work through the county the way any useful thing spreads in a farming country, not by speech or by boast, but by the plain force of what a man can see with his own eyes on a flooded bottom. The spring after the water, Virgil Tanner, who had once leaned on the Renfrew gatepost and taken the willow whips for the delusion of a scarecrow that had lost its field, came to Toby and asked, without quite meeting the boy's eye, how a man might go about setting willows along his own stretch of the creek. Toby told him. He told him plain the way his grandfather had told him the depth to set the whips and the season to cut them, and the years of patience it would take before the roots were worth a thing. And Virgil listened the way a man listens who has watched his neighbor's ground wash away and his neighbor's boy's ground hold, which is to say he listened all the way to the end. The year after that, the Prentice family set their own line of willows along the water where their fences had gone down in the flood. Nobody announced any of it. It moved through the valley the way useful knowledge always moves in such places. Quiet from one man's eyes to the next man's need, spreading not because anyone preached it, but because the water had preached it once in a single night, louder than any man ever could. Amos Ledbetter lived to hear of it. Della drove the boy over to Bourbon County that summer, the summer after the flood, and Toby sat with his grandfather on the porch at the end of the gravel lane and told him, in the few plain words the two of them ever needed with each other, what the Willows had done. The old man listened all the way through, his hands still on the arms of his chair, the deaf old dog asleep at his feet. And when the boy had finished, Amos was quiet a while, looking off toward his own creek in the low evening light, the way he had looked at that ruined gully 2 summers before. Then he said the thing that Toby would carry the rest of his life longer than he carried any other word spoken to him in his growing up. Most folks plant for the harvest they'll see. Takes a rare kind to plant for the flood they won't. He did not explain it. He did not need to. The two of them sat on into the dusk without another word between them. An old man who had spent 30 years teaching farmers to plant for the floods they could not see coming, and a boy who had listened when the whole of a county laughed, and there was nothing left in the evening that wanted saying. The years took Amos Ledbetter the way the years take everyone a winter or two, on quiet in his own bed at the end of his own lane, and Toby stood at the grave in a cold Bourbon County rain, and thought not of the man's ending, but of a booklet worn soft at the corners, and a willow planted for a flood, a boy could not yet see. He kept the booklet all his life. Streambank stabilization using native vegetation. The cheap paper gone softer still, with the years of his own thumb turning, it passed eventually to a son of his own who would ask as sons do what the worn old pamphlet was and why his father kept it when the pages were near falling out. Toby would tell him. Not all of it, not the cut wire, nor the pulled roots, nor the boot prints in the dry creek bed, some weights a man carries to the end without spreading them, but the heart of it, the willows and the water and the grandfather who had known. It would be enough. It would plant in the boy the thing that had been planted in him. The willows are still there. They are old trees now, thick through the trunk, their crowns spreading wide over the water that runs quiet beneath them most of the year, and their roots go a little deeper into the bank of Coldwater Creek with every season that passes, holding the good ground of the South Field, as they have held it since the night of the great water, since the Thursday the creek came out of its banks and found along one stretch of 2 miles a thing it could not eat. That is not a figure of speech. It is not a lesson dressed up in the clothing of a tree. It is only the plain way a willow works, and always has its roots lacing the loose earth into something the water cannot carry off its flexible strength, outlasting the brittle strength that stands against a flood and shatters. The trees do the work they have always done in the dark, out of sight long before, and long after any man thinks to watch them do it.